YouTube, the most common frontier. These are the voyages of SandBox and Chill. Its continuing mission to explore strange new channels, to seek out new RPGs and new podcasts, to boldly go where no one dares to go. So, as we start this, do you want to all introduce your names and
Sure.
where you're from, and then that way I can edit it all fancy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll start. So I'm Josh Newton, one of the co-hosts of Table Top Jorneys. I live in the Great White North. I live in Maine, about 30 miles away from the big city on the coast, if anybody knows that area at all. But yeah, with my wife, my dog, my cat, my 8-month-old. So
I'm Glenn Myers, one of the other co-hosts of Tabletop Journeys. I'm coming at you from, kind of all over the place. Today I'm in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and tomorrow I'll be somewhere in Ohio, and then the day after that I'll get closer and closer till I'm back in New England. But I live in an RV, so I just kind of roll about and go where the wind takes me.
And I'm Lewanika. I'm the third of 3 co-hosts here at Tabletop Journeys, and I hail from the state of Connecticut. That's not where I was born. It's not where but it is where I grew up. I went to high school here, and I am probably the most secured to a fixed location of the 3 of us.
Right.
And then I'm James Gravity Fail. I'm the host of today's interview. I just have one starting icebreaker that I hopefully y'all are very opinionated about. But which Star Trek series?
If you've listened to our show, James, you're pretty opinionated.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, and he just threw out Star Trek off the gut. So let's see where this
which
goes.
Star Trek series is your favorite? And that doesn't have to be who your favorite captain is. So two parts. Which one's your favorite series, and who's your favorite captain?
Okay, I'll start.
Okay,
go ahead.
for it.
No, you start.
All right, I was going to say my favorite series is pretty easy. Although I haven't finished Picard yet to know whether or not it'll have a shot at replacing it, but I doubt it, though it's very good. My favorite series is Voyager. Dude, it's honestly a tough call between that one and I grew up on Next Generation, but Voyager. I'm going to stick with Voyager. And Janeway is solidly my favorite captain, too. She's pretty badass.
So, before recent history, my favorite captain was Ben Sisko, period, hands down, no questions. But I will say that's on television. In books, it had actually almost consistently been Kirk. Kirk in books, other than novels written by Shatner himself, is amazing and a fantastic and wonderful character. But it's been Ben Sisko for the longest time, but until recently. And actually, DS9, also my favorite series. Until recently.
Yeah.
And I say that as Strange New Worlds started out really strong. By the end of Strange New Worlds, I was like, man, it doesn't have to get much better than this, and it's going to overtake as my favorite show. And then, lo and behold, by the end of episode 2, it was definitely, season 2, episode 2 was definitely Strange New Worlds, my favorite series. And by the end of the Lower Decks crossover, without question, Pike was my favorite captain. And it's as much as I love Sisko and the things he did and the type of character that he is and portrayed, there's no within the course of 7 episodes, Pike cleared light years away from Sisko. He's just that good, and I don't think anybody's going to catch him anytime soon.
Right. I haven't actually seen Strange New Worlds yet, so that may be the case for me too, with as much as I'm hearing about it. But we're finishing. My wife and I are finishing Picard first before we move into the other other new ones.
Yeah, I mean, Next Generation is absolutely my favorite show, and I am that basic Star Trek fan where I grew up on Next Generation. Next Generation is my favorite show, absolutely. And much like Lewanika, Picard was always my favorite captain for very much the same reason. He was the captain that I knew. He was my favorite. I am not sure. Here's the one thing that I will say. Captain Pike is very much becoming my favorite captain. But I don't know if it's because of Captain Pike or if it's because of Anson Mount playing Captain Pike. I'm not sure which one it is. But Strange New Worlds is picking up an awful lot of ground. That show is really, really good. And Anson Mount as Captain Pike. I mean, that entire cast is stupid. It's just ridiculous, right? Just up and down the line, that cast is ridiculous. And yeah, Captain Pike is he's gaining a lot of ground on Picard. I think that a lot of it too is that, man, I'm gonna go ahead and go like super hot take here for a minute. I love Patrick Stewart. I have loved Patrick Stewart in everything that he has been in forever. Like, forever. I think that as Picard went along, the Patrick Stewart that we were seeing on screen was not the Patrick Stewart that I remember in my heart. And I think that there were times where that was really obvious. And that has sort of painted my opinion of Picard as a character a little bit. So I think if we look at Picard over the entirety of when Picard has been on screen, not so great at the end like he was. I mean, like in seasons 5 and season 6 of Next Generation, that is the greatest show on television at that point in time. Like just after the Borg stuff happened, but kind of when Picard is kind of dealing with the fallout of all that, best TV on TV at that point. And I think that Picard as a vanity project was maybe more vanity than project.
Mm-hmm.
So, hot take.
Yeah.
I see your hot take, and I'll just say this: Strange New Worlds is lousy for excellence in actors.
Oh God, it's so good. Yeah.
I mean, lousy for excellence. Like the main cast to a person, everything though each individual brings to that screen is just amazing, and the writers on that show.
Yep.
I mean, there are classic writers, DC Fontana and so many others that are just phenomenal and great that I will never take anything away from them. They literally cannot be touched, in my opinion. But I got to tell you, I really want, and I haven't gone and looked at the names to see who they are, but at some point I'm going to have for our Star Trek game, I'm going to have a bunch of shuttles named after the writing staff of Strange New Worlds because
I like it.
They are that good.
Yeah. See, my favorite was I was also Voyager. Like, I used to watch Deep Space Nine as a kid, but Voyager was my go-to. And I think this actually goes more into, I'm not a fan of the Federation, like how it works and the kind of the structure that, seasons 1, 2, and 3 of Next Generation were created. Like when you have a worm alien posing as like an admiral that they kill. I think that was at the end of season 1. I'm like, oh, it just wasn't something I was interested in because it was already set up, and then they're fighting oppression, or not, like kind of like government oppression. Like, I don't want to be an adult yet. I want to discover new things. And that's where Voyager, and this kind of goes into your Kickstarter and factions and stuff. There you have the Federation that is thrust across to some unknown region of the galaxy, having to deal with unknown factions that they're just kind of barreling through because they don't know the customs. Yeah, they don't know their customs. They don't know how cultural things work, and that's where I thought it was really fascinating because it kind of calls back to a little bit of the original Star Trek series where they're going out and exploring and seeing new things. Plus, Janeway, again, I think is underrated in some circles, but definitely one of the better captains at that time. Again, I haven't watched Strange New World, so that might change, apparently.
Yeah. Strange New World is amazing. It really is. You should check it out.
I cannot recommend it enough.
I'm not just hearing it from these two guys. Like, everybody that I know that's talking about Star Trek loves Strange New World, so I'm very hopeful. Mm-hmm. And since we started really drilling into the Star Trek Adventures by Modiphius this year, and with our actual play that we've been running, we've been talking to a lot of Star Trek people.
Yeah. With that, this is your second Kickstarter, correct?
It is, yeah.
Do you want to give a brief overview of exactly what it is?
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to. Like,
Yeah.
that's, I tend to handle a lot of the administrative stuff, so that's kind of my wheelhouse here. Yeah. So our second Kickstarter is actually going to be for book number 4, which every time I say that, it sounds incredible that we're going to be writing our fourth book, because it wasn't that long ago that we hadn't written any books, and now we're writing our fourth one, which is crazy, which is weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, so for book number 4, it is called, as of right now, it's called The Traveler's Guide to Factions. It contains 9 factions that are plug-and-play components that you can bring into any campaign. We're writing them specifically to be largely system agnostic. We're writing them to be units that you can drop into any campaign, in any setting, in any time. So we're going to have, like, Bronze Age components, we're going to have futuristic components, post-apocalyptic components, high fantasy components, all that sort of thing, and kind of express these factions kind of throughout those various time periods. And they're going to be fully comprehensive, living, breathing entities with names and faces and places and all that sort of stuff to really, to again, just to allow you to go ahead and take any of these components and kind of drop them into your campaign, either as player pieces, so they're going to be tips on how to go ahead and play a member of these factions as a player, but also for storytellers out there, how to go ahead and bring them into your game as either player aligned NPCs or as heals to go against your PCs. So.
Right, yeah, they are all definitely written in shades of gray. So there's a couple of factions you could pick out and call good factions, with some air quotes there. Oh, I don't have to tell people that because this is video, so they can see it. Good factions,
you can see the air quotes. Yeah.
And bad factions, and we had some middle ones, and in the end, we're like, not really working because you could play a lot of these in a bunch of different ways depending on what's going on. So yeah, they should be fun and exciting, and you could use them either way.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been seeing a lot more system agnostic settings coming out, especially post OGL and Wizards of the Coast deciding to do what they've decided to do.
Crapping their pants.
Yeah. So what's one of the struggles breaking away from a defined system going towards a system agnostic?
I would say the struggles really break down into 2 areas. And the biggest of them and the hardest to kind of wrap your head around if you're in the content creation vein as we are, is the legal stuff. Trying to make sure without dropping buckets and buckets of cash to have corporate attorneys and attorneys handle and read through all these things, and finding what seems to be a legitimate safe ground to work within and find these parameters is the biggest logistical challenge that we faced. And as that's happening, and that is the company that really caused it, and they're the big fish in the pond, and that's where a lot of the players are. And so trying to work within something that the audience wants and is there for, even though they're largely not that in the know about the details, and rightfully don't care. Look, if I go to see baseball, I don't know a lot about the back of the house stuff. I just want to watch a good game. So I get why fans don't know all these details, but it's a challenge, and that's a big challenge to overcome. The other challenges with moving into other systems is, what can you use? What can't you use? Everybody has their own thing right now. There is no universal standard anymore. And because of that, it's, well, we could do this system, but if we do that, we can only sell it in this place. Well, that's not where the bulk of the audience is, and that's not where the bulk of our audience is. So in some cases, it's finding the right way to do that, and then making it, business is business in some cases, cost effective. Those are big challenges on the content creation side. That is part 1. Part 2, and the part that I prefer to live in, the space I prefer to live in and I enjoy talking about, is in the player adoption and the player enjoyment and the player engagement phase of things. And I would say the challenge there is less insurmountable, but it is still a challenge. People have limited amount of time. There are 4 billion things a person can do at any given time if they're not working, eating, or taking care of their family, right? And to ask them to spend even 2 hours of that time with something I've created is a huge responsibility. And so for me to create something that's fun for them, it also has to be easy to pick up, easy to learn, but at the same time, it has to be as rewarding as something that was difficult to pick up and difficult to learn. That is the challenge of what we're trying to do, stepping away from the core 5e mechanic right now. It's not insurmountable. The number of podcasters that are out there trumpeting this same song in their various and millions of different ways, all of them out there, even to have Jenny D talk about this stuff with all of her thousands and thousands and thousands of listeners, and I don't even know how many,
because they were they were coming after her money, basically, her and like Critical Role. Yeah, they were like, money please.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got pockets. I'm shaking you down.
Yeah.
That's really what that came down to, right? They sent the Pinkertons after somebody on the magic side of their house, but they sent the big guns at the rest of us. Really, the Pinkertons were kind of like a symptom. They came at all of us on the content creation side, and so the fact that so many content creators, podcasters, YouTubers, and every other platform you can imagine are out there trumpeting that. We should not feel that we're in an echo chamber, even though it feels like that sometimes. We are making a difference to each other. We are supporting each other, and I love that about our community. But at the same time, we've got to go out there and create great content, because if we now fall down and don't create great content, the guy with the cheaper content, and it is in theory cheaper because it's them, and it's more accessible because they have all the money to put it everywhere, they could win that audience. They could say, buy our product. So taking a product or an idea and saying, look, we're going to do the lore system agnostic. We're going to have base rules that are 5e compatible, gets people in. Then we're going to also be adding, or have the ability to add through stretch goals and audience interest, other system types where their rules allow these other elements, so somebody can say, I can play it in this other game. Because some of these other games don't have the lore. They don't have the bucket load of adventures, or they don't have the side factions. They don't have that connective tissue that really makes those games sing as much as something that's been established. So what we're hoping to do is to create some of that connective tissue, carry over and bring in some new folks to these other systems, but also provide something for people who are already in the other systems. Use this. This is going to work great, because a faction, every game needs a faction. If you're playing in a tabletop game, you need to have your players see what the world, how the world is impacted by this group and this group. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they are at loggerheads, and sometimes players are on one side or the other, but often they're right in the middle. And that's where the drama is. That's where the fun at the table is.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that people overlook all the time, although everyone's lives, we're mired in various factions. We just don't call it that in our daily life. We're like, that political party, that organization I'm with is against that other organization that I'm not with, or something. It's the same concept, except for you're putting it into like a fantasy or role play setting, and giving it like rules to like build your own faction, how to
actually
build this for various stages.
How to build your own will be one of our chapters, aside from the 9, and we hadn't mentioned that specifically yet, but we are creating the 9 factions. But as we're going through all of this research, and we're coming up with all of these processes and categories and the templates that we're using to bring them to life, we're also going to be including a template on how we did it. You know, what steps we think are important to fill to help you create your own, so you can then do exactly that, take your ideas and flesh them out more. But in each one, we'll also have ideas in them for how you can change them and customize them to make them more your own as well.
The goal really there is to say, if you like these things, then you probably have the knowledge or the stories in your heart to make more. And we can't obviously make everything. So what we want to do is give people the tools. Like if you wish to describe a faction, that if you're a storyteller and you wish to describe a faction so your players can engage with it, or it might be in some new town, well, here's some basic building blocks of of a faction that should work for you. And if you're a player who loves backstory and wants to come from some group, but you don't like the things that have been out there available, the Harpers are just boring you to tears or what have you, because it's been done over and over and over again. And by the way, the Harpers in novels, fantastic. A great group in novels. The way they're done in some games, not as great, So, we're going to have tools so you can build your own thing, or we're going to have tools that allow a DM to take some factions that exist in other games and improve them. What about that DM who says, I really like the Harpers in this story, but I don't think they're good enough? What can I do? Add some traditions, because nothing written about the Harpers, except for probably that second edition Splat book, goes into any of that. Right. So, and that Splat book is probably pretty hard to find unless you're knocking down my door. And if you're coming for me, I no longer live in Connecticut. I just moved out while we were recording this, but because that Splat book is mine.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a tool like that, but you can take any faction in any game and improve it just by adding those things. What are some unique things they have on their walls? What are some unique tips, tools, and techniques you can do to build out the factions you already have in your game? These are the kind of things that we're going to be putting into this book.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was interesting while doing research on your podcast was you were also you all were talking about taking real world examples for tabletop settings. With this, will you have any general guidelines or rules about, like, hey, maybe don't one for one take real world examples and put them into your games, or how to be more culturally aware when applying existing traditions to factions?
I absolutely think that's kind of built into the fabric of what we do, but there's probably going to be some kind of notation or tips to that effect. I know we talked about it in our one of our recent episodes on that topic, and I had made the point that I tend to stay away from getting too deeply into cultures that I am not a member of, and that's a personal choice. I don't think I would ever do anything to harm or ridicule or poorly mimic any particular group. I just don't tend to do that. That's a preference on my part because it's important to me. But similarly, I think it's also important for me to represent the cultural groups that I do come from and the situations that I come from. Sometimes it's talking about my family in Africa. Sometimes it's talking about my family in the West Indies. Sometimes it's just talking about my socioeconomic background and the neighborhoods I grew up and the conditions that I grew up in. And I probably lean on that more because that's more direct and personal experience versus stories that have been passed on. So I strongly encourage people to do that. And I think the way we've built these factions really does lean in on some of those things. I don't think anything I write comes from nowhere. It all comes from a place of
Everything is inspired by something. Yeah, absolutely, Lewanika. Yeah. But absolutely, you are right. There will be, almost guaranteed, because that chapter hasn't been written yet, but I cannot picture writing a section in the How to Make Your Own Faction where we're talking about where to get sources of information. And we would definitely say, you can find a lot of inspiration in the world around you. It's a very rich environment with plenty of factions, societies, cultures, etc. to draw from. But just knowing the three of us, I can't picture us writing that sentence or that paragraph without closing it with a sentence or two at least about, but be careful what you bring in and how you portray it, because if you make it too obviously related to the real world and you don't do it justice, you will be offending somebody and their heritage or their beliefs somewhere. And if they sit at your table, that can kill your game. So you really need to be careful. So yeah, I would definitely say that's going to wind up in there.
Being representative without appropriating, right? Like that's kind of you can pay homage to certain things, and you've got to do it right and kind of stay on the right side of the line, right? So
we had a conversation with an Asian content creator not too long ago, earlier this year, I believe it was, and he had made the comment that Cyberpunk is a great game, but it very much leaned really far into the Red Menace, the Asian, the yellow threat, the Yellow Menace, and it caused me to rethink some of my thinking about that game and games in general, and a lot of modern games, because and I started making a conscious decision about how I do modern action films. And if there's going to be a gang, I tend to do multicultural gangs. I tend no longer to do a monolithic gang or whatever. And that may not be as accurate as we want it to be in the world we live in today, because there are very monocultural organizations, good and ill. But at the same time, that's not what I want to portray at my table. And that's not the world. If I want a fictional world that has antagonists and bad things in it, I don't necessarily want anybody to be able to say, oh, it's all that kind of person, or it's all that kind of person. I want people to say they're bad because they make bad decisions and they hurt people, not because they all look away. And that's a conscious choice, and and I'm so proud of being able to have those conversations, because I never thought about that, because it wasn't my culture and it didn't dawn on me. But now I'm very cognizant of how I build, stereotypes, and how I do that, and playing against types, and if somebody's going to be that, I make it very clear that it's not that. And I just tend to play games that do not have a significant racial component unless it's fantasy race, and I then make sure those fantasy races do not have a one-to-one real world analog, because I don't want to perpetuate that.
Yeah, it sounds like possibly some writers at on Baldur's Gate 3 should have listened to that. I don't know if you've played it all, but the first act is pretty rough.
That's not good. So, that game, like, it was so. I actually haven't heard that, and I have not gotten into Baldur's Gate 3 yet. But that's kind of disappointing that's kind of continuing to be a problem.
It is, and I'm looking forward. I still am looking forward to Baldur's Gate 3. When I heard it was coming out, I immediately started Baldur's Gate 1 again. Got it off of Steam to get myself ready to play, and then I was horribly disappointed that they did a paid playtest effectively, because I don't want to pay for a incomplete game and be part of helping you fix it. I want to play the finished product, and so I have not dove into it yet. But apparently, that first chapter,
it's a little rough. It goes to some old school tropes and concepts that you don't usually see at a home table, which that's one of the things, because you are content creators and you have your own home games. What do you ever feel like when you're making something for the public that you have to scrutinize yourselves more than your home game, or is it just so common for you on both ends that it's like it's the same? Whether if you were to record me at my home game, it's the same as if you were to for live streaming.
It's close, but there's a difference.
I would say close, but there's a difference.
Because we do it already. We automatically scrutinize the things and the ideas that we put forward and say, wait, we need to change that term because that implies something racial. Or, wait, I never thought about it before, but these people seem a little skeevier than we meant them to. We didn't portray them that way in our home game necessarily, but in whatever write-up we did about them, it came off that way. So we do police ourselves on that, but it's not as much as you'd think. We tend to keep our home games pretty close to what we're talking about.
Yeah, even when we were considering artists, but even when we were considering artists and we're looking through art, looking at stuff, like just kind of like doing a general survey of every artist that's on the internet, just to go ahead and see what kind of styles we wanted and everything like that. And I remember seeing a bunch of things. I was like, we can absolutely not use this. Like, if this is the kind of imagery this artist uses, it's way too close. Who knows what this person's going to go ahead and put in what we're going to pay him for? Like, we absolutely cannot have any of that in there.
Or worse yet, who knows what else they did that we're not seeing that will come up after we're published.
Not seeing.
That's a scary thing. I would say, like Glenn said, we are extremely close. We are very good about session zeros and have been for probably the last 10, 15 years or so, long before we started the podcast. So that's something we were doing anyway. And so because of that, when some of our home games might be vastly different than what we would put out for a product, but that's because we've cleared it with the table.
Yeah, right. So designed it for those players.
Yeah. So my game is very much for the players I have. Like my big homebrew game I started that campaign world at the local game shop, so it was anybody wants to come and sit down and play can play kind of game.
Mm-hmm.
So it had to be issue free just for that reason.
Yeah.
The second big reason is my son at the time was 10 when he started with that group. My good friend and my battle buddy from my army days, his two kids were 10 and 12 at the time that started. So these are the kids that I raise. And when we built that game, Glenn and his wife were not able to stay with the game, but it was designed with the point of bring the kids, they can play too.
Yeah.
So a large part of it was, is this a game I'm comfortable rearing my child with?
Yeah.
And so that's the major game world that I play, even though I did a slightly more adult version for an adult convention that's still ongoing and now a home game as well. We can get into slightly more adult themes, but there are certain things that I just don't dig. I'm not big on, like, it has become over a recent history, making things with dragon armor is weird for me, because if you think about it, they're a sentient being.
Yeah.
Skinning a sentient being isn't really cool.
Why are we talking about that? Why is that a thing? So for me, what I've said is, I would be okay if the history on a dragon item is something that the dragon gave of themselves, like they bequeathed this and gave this to somebody, or if it's an evil thing, that might be something that was taken from somebody. But no one's running around in dragon armor that from a dragon they killed, because that's just wrong. I don't go to war, and this is as a soldier. I've not fought in a theater of combat.
Yeah.
But it is not okay for a soldier in the U.S. Army to go wear parts of the people they fight. That's not okay.
Yeah,
it's never been okay.
Yeah,
and so
you're gonna have to run that by Dolph
in my
Lundgren
game.
and Universal Soldier.
But he was the bad guy, and so if a bad guy does it,
he was
that's the bad guy, right?
Right.
A little less cool that in later films he comes back and he's moderately a good guy, because I don't know how you come back from that. I haven't made that switch yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of some real world times that people have used other people as materials for making things. Which is we treat it as taboo. And then also the classic Necronomicon, where it's like made of human flesh kind of thing, where it's like it's evil. Maybe it's because I haven't thought about it in that context before, with dragons and playing things like Skyrim, where you go and slaughter dragons and then make armor. You're like, oh yay, armor. But
they're all bad dragons. Like all the dragons are bad except for Parthenax, who's a good dragon. But that's But this is the big problem with House of a Thousand Corpses, the movie, though, right? Is that like House of a Thousand Corpses, those people were disgusting, but they were just so likable. You kind of didn't view them as villains because they were just like, they were just kind of fun. And then you start thinking about it, like, no. These people are disgusting.
So people out there agree too. Like the majority of the populace agrees, and I'm actually going to use Parthenax since you brought him up as an example. Well, sometimes people are all about like, let's harvest everything it's got. According to my wife's vast reading of the Skyrim subreddit, which is her favorite subreddit in the entire world, it's like only 5% of players, based on polls that have been put out, kill Parthenax when you're asked to by the Blades for the Blades quest, because he's the good dragon. He's your friend. He helps you. He teaches stuff. So they don't want to kill him. They don't want to take his bones. They don't want to harvest his soul. I mean, when you're actually looking at it from the perspective of somebody you knew, you liked, you trusted, that's not something most people are interested in. So I think we're headed in the right direction with stopping the harvesting of sentient beings.
Now, that said, I have done some back in 3.5 days, I did some D20 modern games where basically following the Reign of Fire, where the creatures were not sentient. And I've played games where, in that case, I just took dragons and they're beasts. And in that case, then it became more of a protection, more like Aliens, where it's like, look, I'm just using this like Aliens versus Predator, where it's like, use this, it'll protect you from their acid blood. Use this because it'll actually pierce their hide, kind of thing. Where the Predator's teaching Zoe Saldana's character how to do that or whatever. So I think that was that's something that I'm interested in. So it's not like I don't think the idea of it's bad. It's just in the context aspects of them being sentient spellcasters and these things that have these very complex humanistic attitudes and beliefs, that's where I have a problem with it. So I try to avoid that type of dissonance in my games.
Well, and that's a going back to like having the importance of having 0 sessions. That's also definitely something as a DM, provide that you, because you all have also mentioned like you can get really interesting stories by showing your players that you are a safe space. So even if it is something that like, you don't go towards, it is something like as a DM that you can weave later to signify that someone is a bad person. Like you haven't harvested a dragon, but you find a book that's covered in dragon scales that gives off, a menacing aura of some kind. Whoever made it did something bad.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in that same
session
world, you could have good dragons, like you have the good dragons and the bad dragons in the Dragonlance world, who gift scales to help
Yeah.
the good heroes make armor, as opposed to having to, murder them and skin them and take all their flesh.
The beauty of this game is if you find something that doesn't make good narrative sense when you really break it down and think about it, or really creates that, man, I don't think that just feels ick. If you find something with that ick factor, there's probably a good narrative way to get that same mechanical benefit and work around that. You just got to, do a little mental work, and you can have that happen.
Or
Well,
use that ick factor to, more evilly personify your bad guy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. Well, and that's the interesting thing to go back to your current Kickstarter, where you have factions which you provide lore similar to that you can give a player to let them build their like backstory, like say, hey, I'd like to use these factions in the world. Here's this document, and maybe you like this faction, and then they read through and they're like, oh yeah, I've been wanting a character like this, or even then some player provides you, I really want to be a barbarian who does whatever, and you're like, this faction right here would match, and you would align perfectly with this group, and take a quick read, and that also gives them, it saves. It does a couple things, because I don't know how often it happens to you for your games, but your players who really want to write, which is great, but they give you that 12-page backstory of lore that you're like, how do I put this in? Well, I'll figure it out. I mean, I'm one of those players, but I've learned to cut it down to bullet points.
Yeah.
I try to keep my backstories to 3 pages these days.
3 pages.
Yeah,
If I can't get it down to 3 pages, I've done too much.
Yeah.
I've learned to do the bullet point thing, and I learned that through a couple older games that I used to play, Mechton, and with its life path system, and then D&D 3.5 had a life path system in their Heroes and Allies splat book as well, and I've kind of merged the two of those depending on the genre I'm playing in. And what I've learned to do, because both of those had this section where at a certain point you got so many events and they equaled how many years you were around, so I would literally set the age of my character and then do this, and then I have X number of years of events, and I would have bullet points, and I would make sure I would leave a certain amount of them totally blank, and I would hand them to my GM. Glenn has probably been the recipient of more of those than any, but it was, but it was one of those things where I tended, so I usually kept my backstory pages to about 1 to 2 pages, and then I would hand them saying, there's a couple blank years, fill that in as you will. Let me know the things that I should know, or maybe something happened in my background that I wouldn't know, and that's just what you're filling in was the defining event of that time frame. And that way the storyteller has the ability to impact that and weave me into their plot. And I usually try to make sure they get at least 2 good NPCs out of my backstory, and probably at least 1, if not 2, antagonists out of my backstory.
But tying it to our factions book, one of our stretch goals is specifically to do a background for players and a corresponding feat to be the feature for the background for each faction. Specifically to add that player piece, so that they're not just kind of inventing it on their own. There will actually be, the information to create that background. And at first, that part will be 5e, because that's the main set. 5e compatible is the main set of rules that we have to work with right now. But we have another stretch goal to then convert that into the Tales from the Valiant heritages and their system where they've split it up. Thank you, and ancestries. I couldn't think of the other word. To create that as well for the Tales of the Valiant system as it comes out. And then our hope for future projects is to continue adding more of the games that we learn along those lines to
as we learn other systems and newer games come out and we get a better handle on what we can legally do with other game systems, we will start adding and increasing. And for the game systems where we can't legally publish, that's where it's going to be use this lore. And then you can do that. We can certainly take any game system if we can't publish for it and know what that setting is and say, hey, if you're playing in this extremely sci-fi'd out apocalyptic thing where giant bug creatures might be roaming around, here's a way you could use this faction. And we may not be able to publish for that at this stage because it may not be the way you can do that, but at least we're telling people who play that game there. And for those, I'm not saying anything about Free League. I've actually not even looked into what their legal issues are. It just happened to be an IP that I could think of on the fly. But
right, because that's a good thing to think about for anyone who's trying to also start a Kickstarter. Is ideas are great, but it's great to double check what system you're gonna try and publish with, because you had also like talked to like Savage World, and they had tiers of how people could publish and where they could publish.
Yep. So let me tell you the story about our first Kickstarter.
That's where I was going to go.
It was a set of 12, and we kind of had them grouped into sets of 3. So we had like I'm trying to remember, we had the Shadow Dwellers, which are like your Warlock and your Sorcerer, and like kind of like dark Shatterkai inspired subclasses, and didn't mention Shatterkai because I knew that was against the SRD. You couldn't mention that, right? That kind of thing. Well, one of the trios of subclasses that we had was a set of Dragonlance subclasses, specifically Dragonlance. Right?
We knew the setting was
had
coming.
the Order of Bright Blades. Knew the setting was coming. We're like, oh, this would be great. We'll do Dragonlance. And we had literally put together the promo video for it, put it out on YouTube when a friend of the show sent us a message and was like, hey, you can do Dragonlance in a Kickstarter. We're like, what do you mean you can't do Dragonlance? Like, no. You can only do Dragonlance content. If you're going to brand it as Dragonlance content, you can only put it out through a DM's Guild. Only. Right. Period. So it's like all of a sudden, so here we are, we're 2 weeks before our campaign is going to launch. We've already commissioned art. We've already and then all of a sudden we realized that we had to redo 25% of our campaign with 2 weeks before we were set to launch. So that was kind of a stressful couple of weeks there, where it was like, oh crap, what do we do? We actually, because we've been planning this thing for months at this point, and had just put out the promo material, everything was rolling right along. We were full steam ahead, and we're like, oh, that's actually not going to work. And so it took us shuffling around some of the groups. We thankfully, I think, Glenn, you had some extras that were just kind of sitting around well, I've been working on these, but they're not really polished yet, so I don't really know what to do with them. So
right. And you rewrote the new Paladin for the Oath of, what is the Oath of?
Boy, we should really know that. We
should. Oath of Loyalty.
Yeah.
I kept trying to go with obedience, but that wasn't the right word. Oath of Loyalty Paladin versus the Oath of the Bright Blades.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things,
and then those got to become a DM's Guild publication. Just as this last Dragonlance book came out, we took those 3 and put them out on DM's Guild as a Dragonlance publication.
Yeah. We're pretty good about nothing we create is ever totally lost. But I will say one of the lessons we learned about the first Kickstarter was better timing as far as our promise to publish. But I will say a lot of the delays did stem from the fact that we did have such significant rewrites and starts. We had one of the subclasses had to be built wholesale. Hadn't been started before that 2 week before the Kickstarter.
And then the play testing that we had to squeeze in.
Play testing, as compared to other ones, which a couple of the ones that I had worked on specifically had been play tested in my homebrew games for about a year before the Kickstarter even began. So I actually had a pretty good feel for where we needed to go with it. And so while it did got some significant tweaking in the playtest process, it was pretty much nearly ready to go as we began the Kickstarter, about where you'd want something to be when you're doing a Kickstarter. So we've kind of learned that lesson and really checked the legalities before we got ready to launch and hired our artists and built our promos and things like that.
Yeah, that's because that's one of the things that they can get you on all the time. That
Oh,
because
yeah.
I've published a couple things to DM's Guild and avidly read through the what you can and cannot publish and where, and they can't really get you on the rules, but they can definitely get you on the IP of
Sure.
Dragonlance or Ed Greenwood's
Eberron, yeah.
that's and
Yeah.
that's even as I make my own content because I like one of my go-tos that I just do for fun is I'll pull 5 random magic cards. However, they're still Wizards of the Coast, and most of the settings are either like Eberron or something else. So if I actually publish anything, I have to do it like you said, double check and make sure it's not. I'm allowed to publish it where I want to publish it.
Right. And I mean, there's a ways around a lot of the jargon when you're working with the IP specific things.
Yeah.
You know, like Goliaths aren't SRD as a playable race, but if you're writing a D&D product that's referring to a Goliath, you can call them Giantkin. There's lots of ways around it, and in the end, if you've got something that's that specific, put it out on DM's Guild too. Even if you regularly run, you know, your products through itch.io afterwards and Kickstarters first or what have you, because if you've got a specific and quality product that would be marketable on DM's Guild, that's a huge market of people that you're getting exposure to that might then come to your brand. So, you know, write it all, man.
It's one of the reasons why we continue to do some Dragonlance content and some content because one, we had already written it and we're like, we're not going to throw this away. This is really good stuff. It needs to be, it needs to see light. It needs to be played at a table. So, but then it just became, okay, if we can't do it with this project, then when's going to be a good time to release it? Well, new book's coming out in August. We'll plan on releasing it then.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point I think a lot of people when they're starting out don't think about time scales for publication, not only for publishing maybe a written work or a podcast, but videos as well. How far ahead do you actually plan for everything that you're making between the podcast or Kickstarter and other content?
Vastly different scales depending on the type of project.
Kickstarters are big.
Yeah.
So
Kickstarters are huge, and that is probably 6 months to a year in advance we start planning what that's going to be. Others are a little bit shorter time frame. So like the Dragonlance book technically started last year with things that were removed, but honestly they were removed and put into a Google folder that we didn't even touch until after the last Kickstarter finished. So we weren't really looking at that, building on that, working on that in any meaningful fashion until probably April,
May or June.
April, May. Those being that they were already 80% complete because we'd already gone through all of the original rights, some of the play testing. So, you know, we didn't need as much time for those.
Yeah. So, so those written projects can be like that. Podcast stuff, that has a much shorter turnaround, and some things are a little bit longer. So our actual play, we actually planned out our whole season for that. So we kind of have a roadmap, like a writer's room on a television show. Your producer, which is the 3 of us in this case, or actually Josh and I, because Glenn just plays in this one. It's our gift to him to let him be a player. Yeah. So we actually
3 storytellers would be complicated.
Yeah, it'd be way more
Who was
complicated
already?
too.
Yeah. So we kind of had a rough plot. Like we need, okay, here's what we're going to do at the beginning. Here's our middle section, and here's our end for season 1. So we plotted that out and knew where that's going. And so we had, I would say, out of all of the episodes that'll be done for it, we had like 4 of them fairly well, if not partially written. And then everything else was more what seems to be working. Where do we want to go? Some of it even like once we find out from like what players are going to be in it, like, okay, these are the strengths, weaknesses of these characters. This will challenge them in a certain way. So we'll make that. Like, I wouldn't say any of it's on the fly, but some of the adventures that at least our Patreons play in, which affects the game world of our actual play, some of those have been loose outlines until probably two weeks before, and then it gets finalized at that point. Then on the editing, once it's recorded, editing is generally done on an actual play about maybe a month in advance. The rough editing actually happens a little bit further in advance, but some of those get finished a couple days before we air it. But the recording session is we record those and play those sessions and record those sessions in some cases as much as 2 months or 3 months in advance.
But some things get turned around even faster. For a great example of our fast turnaround time, on Tuesday we recorded our episode on Dragons of Fate, the new Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman novel that will come out on this Friday. So we recorded it that night. Yeah, tomorrow. Lewanika did the rough editing that same night. Josh processed it the next morning. Then we did our quality listen so it could go out to our Patreons, and now it releases tomorrow. We don't normally do it that fast, but we were already a week off where we wanted to do our review of this book. So we wanted to get it out quickly, and because the book just came out at the beginning of August. We don't want to be putting our episode out about it in October, So that one we turned around fast on purpose. But normally it's not that quick.
Yeah. With that, just to go back a little bit to like getting your Kickstarter ready and the time it takes into doing that, how is testing like your factions different than say testing like a subclass?
Ooh, factions are
infinitely different. Yeah,
infinitely different because
I think factions are easier.
Yeah,
way easier
because they're more lore heavy and less mechanic heavy. Subclasses are so mechanically heavy that if they're not balanced, they'll throw off a whole campaign and you'll get the banhammer. So you really have to tweak those and playtest those and work on those.
Honestly, the bulk of the playtesting will come in if we hit the stretch goals where we're building in the feats and the backgrounds, because those are mechanical elements. Everything else is this is how you interact, this is what you do. And so as long as we are relatively careful with members of this organization get a Lamborghini and $14,000 and keys to the nuclear suitcase, as long as we don't do something like that, the faction can exist. And the one of the categories that we've specifically spoken about for each of the factions is resources that the faction has and resources they're willing to provide the players at given levels. So we're very much into a 4-tier system to hallmark of 5e, but the idea being if you're only a first-tier character, no matter who you might be the progeny of, you're not getting everything that this faction has to offer at this lower level. That's something we're working on, but I think really that's the only part where playtesting really comes in, because the rest is just lore and hey, does this fit your story?
Yeah, exactly. I think honestly the scrutiny is going to come from these two way more than it will be anybody externally for anything that I'm writing, I know in particular, right? But with the subclasses, it was like, no, we're like bringing people together. Like we used to do an entire series of shows on our channel, Warfare, where basically we would all roll up.
Which I think we should get back to, because we haven't finished them all.
We should get back to, once we're kind of done being mad at Wizards of the Coast, maybe we should get back into that, because they were an awful lot of fun. But
they were.
But we'd all roll up tunes in the same class. Yeah, and then we'd like, okay, so all three of us are playing barbarians, and then we bring in somebody to go ahead and run a scenario for us. And that's kind of the same way that we tested the subclasses, honestly, is that we like pulled 12 friends together and we divided up into 3 groups, and each one got one and kind of did them in different combinations and everything, and then the 3 of us would sit down for 2 or 3 hours afterwards and be like, okay, wow, that warlock, oh boy, we cannot let that warlock have that power, that does not work.
Holy cow, we need to tone the ruffian down because he's just dropping everything.
He's dropping everything, and so it was a lot more intensive and had to go through a lot more rounds than we thought it was going to. I think, if I'm speaking for myself, right, is that like we figured we rolled in like cowboys. We're like, oh man, we've got these subclasses, we've been playing this game forever, we know what we're doing, and we put it out there, and then that first round of playtesting was ugly. It was bad. It was like, we have some work to do.
Yeah.
But what was really fun about that was applying a bit of the scientific method. Like, I'm not a scientist. Yeah. I don't even play one on television.
Most illogical.
Occasionally on the podcast. But one of the things that we did is like, okay, so if we're going to playtest these to see how they work in balance or as balance, we would need to have the same scenario. So we did them at the same time. So the 3 of us ran the same scenario. So we each wrote a scenario at a given tier, and then we each ran the same scenario with different characters, and then I had to compare how that worked. So we had to be very much in sync how the scenario ran, so that we were literally testing the characters playing in it, not anything else. So we really had to isolate what they were doing. And then we had to, in the process of evaluating that and comparing notes, some of it was, okay, so we know this type of player does this kind of type of thing. They're more tactically minded. Next time we do this, let's put them with a different type of character to see if it's more them than the character. So we had to do some juxtaposition stuff there, because you have to account for that. No plan survives contact with the enemy or the player, right? So and not that players are enemies, but the same rule happens to apply to both very distinct and different groups. But so we really had to account for that.
One of my biggest takeaways during that, one of the things that we didn't realize up front, was when you're creating an encounter to playtest a specific group of subclasses, what we should have been doing from the beginning is designing the encounters to feature the abilities we want to test. Well, we didn't realize that at first. So like our first 2 rounds of playtesting after we designed these encounters, they didn't give us everything we wanted, because they were just cool general encounters, but there was nothing in it to trigger that ability from that subclass, or to give this subclass the ability to show how one of the druids, their pinnacle ability is a water shape, is a wild shape called Body of Water. Well, if there's no water in the entire map for them to jump into and use Body of Water, that's not going to get play tested now, is it? So there's a lot of, there's so much thought that went into it that we didn't realize.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like if you're trying to say balance a barbarian versus a rogue, but you just put them in a giant empty space, the barbarian's going to win because there's nowhere for the rogue to hide, stealth, or get that advantage. So yeah, the
same thing as designing an adventure for your players. Know your players, write the adventure for them. For running a playtest, know the classes and write the adventure for them. So we checked that box and learned it.
What are like other systems that you have really enjoyed playing or reviewing or talking about with some of your guests?
So many, but I'm going to start with our friend our friend Michael at the RPG Academy, Action 12 Cinema, and it is less of a total tabletop game and more of a board game tabletop blend. But Action 12 Cinema,
kind of a collaborative storytelling game, more than anything else,
it is fan freaking tastic. Had me in stitches. Love it. Like the amount of fun we had when we played that game with Michael and the 3 of us was awesome. And I can say with a great deal of hubris and pride that some of the things we did in our playtest, because this was before it even launched as a Kickstarter by a good bit actually, was so much fun that he actually wrote rules based on some of the things we did. And one of the key rules, my favorite rule in the game, is what's known as a mic drop. So it's like when you're playing that game, and if there's a moment where a song would come into play and one of the players actually does that, there's benefits that happen for the characters. And that all happened because while we were doing it, we're in this, we're doing this whole montage thing where we're going from one place to another, and I literally just started belting out, and I would walk 500 miles. I would walk 500 more.
That's when we were flying my character's uncle's old, like, World War II bomber that he kept in his garage across the ocean to get to Ireland.
Yeah, and we had that Indiana Jones line going there, and the whole time, like, we're talking about it, I'm just in the background singing the song, and it was and we're so.
This game is all about creating a B-rate movie. That's what the game is. You're creating a B-rate movie complete with dialogue that doesn't make sense, scenes that get dropped and never come back. Like anything can happen. It's supposed to be terrible, and it was so much fun.
Yeah, and so much ridiculous fun.
I was just going to say, for me, it's almost any of the indie or new games that we were doing playtests for, where we had the creator run it to do a game demo for their Kickstarter or their launch. All of those were amazing. One of the most famous that we talk about all the time is Faith No More's The Real Thing. And and that was a game based off of the album The Real Thing, sanctioned by the band. The Jason Ward and Jason Percy put together. They are from
Accidental Cyclops Games.
Thank you. It was Cyclops something, Accidental Cyclops Games. And that game was fantastic. We brought one of our podcasting friends, Mike from 19 Hits the Dragon, in to play with us, and that was some of the best fun I've ever played. But Babies and Broadswords was amazing too. That's like Muppet Babies or Rugrats meets D&D in like a strange D&D orphanage. That was amazing too. Most of those games were playing something new, or where we had the creator run it because they know it so much better than anybody else could. Were fantastic.
And The Real Thing was kind of our first Powered by the Apocalypse game too. So I mean, we'd kind of like, we knew about Powered by the Apocalypse games at that point, but that was kind of our first like
all three of us
venture
our first
into one. And like the possibilities that it opened up were just like mind blowing. And I think that a lot of it, I think a lot of kind of what we've experienced through PBTA and kind of the super collaborative games like that have continued to kind of inform our content creation going forward. But even when you look at like, kind of like the opposite end of the spectrum, like when we brought the guys from Against the Darkmaster in to run an Against the Darkmaster game. Against the Darkmaster is very much like kind of like a high fantasy kind of Tolkien-esque, but kind of OSR inspired, super duper crunchy rules. And it was so much fun, like having so good, and having the people from Against the Darkmaster come and run it for us was like, okay, like yes, we'll let you come and run a game we'll let you come and run your game for us. Yeah, that's please,
And while we got to talk to all of the creators because the company's out of Italy. On the upside, the guy who ran the game for us, Nick, lives in New York, so that made timing a little bit easier than trying to set it all up with the guys from Italy. But they were super cool, and they sent us a copy of the rule book that they signed so that we can sign it, because we're gonna give that to the fan that suggested it, which we still haven't done. I'm so sorry, sir. It's coming.
I mean, so we're talking about how like this is the Kickstarter for book 4. I mean, you want to talk about how like all these have informed our playstyle. Book 1 was a book all about bringing collaborative world building play styles to specifically your Dungeons and Dragons game, right? And
Traveler's
so
Guide to collaborative world building.
Traveler's Guide to Collaborative World Building, exactly. Still available on DM's Guild, the copper selling Traveler's Guide to Collaborative World Building, I will add. Nice. So yeah, like it was all about taking things that like we learned from like The Burning Wheel and Powered by the Apocalypse and stuff like that, and saying, okay, how can we go ahead and make Dungeons and Dragons better? Because we play a lot of D&D. How can we make that better? What can we learn from these other systems to go ahead and bring them in? Because that's what it's all about at the end of the day, is learning from other systems, lifting what you can take, stuff like that. So.
And we worked that into most of the things we write, like the Dragonlance adventure that we wrote for Jimmy from Splinterverse, which is touted by DM's Guild as one of the best publications ever put on DM's Guild, and we have a piece in it. Woohoo! We wrote one of the adventures.
Platinum selling Dragonlance Companion.
Our campfire scenes in that help you get to know the protagonist that you're escorting to the Tower of High Sorcery for their test. Are very much designed after what we do for collaborative world building in D&D, and they were very well received. And so far,
that's there's so many things that you talked about, because it's one is I definitely like how in a lot of indie games coming out, the collaborative world building is being more prominent than previously, where the players do. They may not want to be a DM, but they definitely want to like have a say in kind of like how the story goes. Yeah. And
it gives them ownership.
Yeah, it makes them invested. Because I used to see all the time DMs being like, "How do I get my players invested?" It's like, well, let them help you write the story.
Right.
It seems simple to us, but it's actually kind of novel. My goal would be in 20 years to have my grandchildren play a game and have collaborative world building. Here, go back and listen to this episode and say, you mean people didn't do that? Like, why wouldn't you? Like, I want it to become that
old enough they can do
ubiquitous.
Once upon a time, kids, it was, I dare you to play in my game. I don't want your
Yeah.
opinion. You just have to try to survive the crap I've designed for you.
Yeah, that classic
That is
like
true.
dungeon
One of my
run.
grandkids is currently playing D&D. His dad has got him pretty well set up. My granddaughter watches B5 with them as well. So yeah, I'm setting it up. I'm 3 generations deep right now.
Well, you're the only one of us that's got that third generation yet so far, Grandpa. So
Yeah. Fair.
One of,
Pop is the official term.
one of my last questions that I had was, how do you all, because you do have a wide array of participants in your Discord. I snuck in there and was checking things out. How do you handle the variety of critiques, and then also how do you figure out which ones are actually like valuable feedback and critiques?
all feedback is
Huh.
valuable.
Mhm.
All feedback is valuable, even if it's crap, because sometimes it is. Sometimes somebody's just being a hater. But there's a kernel of
Yeah,
why they
sometimes we're
decided.
just
There's a
wrong.
kernel of why they decided
Yeah.
to hate in there somewhere,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So ignore the part that's making you feel a certain kind of way and look for what are they responding to,
Mhm.
and then decide if that fits within what we want to put out there as part of our product. And if so, we're sorry you didn't like it. Maybe you'll like our next one. If not, you'll find somebody else to buy from.
Yeah,
Not
I
that we
think
don't want your
ultimately
business, but we can't please everybody.
that's really what it comes down to is trying to. It's not about trying to go ahead and take every piece of feedback and action on it. Sometimes it is very much about like, yep, you are totally right. That warlock would be so much better if we went a totally different direction with him. You are absolutely right. Have a ton of fun writing it, because that's not the warlock we wrote. This is the warlock that we wrote. So we hear your feedback. You're absolutely right, but no, like that's not what we wrote. And that's so sometimes it does come down to that, and it's more about again, it's kind of digesting it, and honestly, it's about beating it around the three of us. It's like we keep joking. So like a lot of our books are written from the perspective of the traveler, right? Kind of like this like ambiguous entity that scours the multiverse for all sorts of things. And we've made the joke that the traveler is really a three-headed dragon, right? Because like the three of us are the traveler in some form or another, right? Which explains why the traveler's voice is sometimes different in various snippets and all that sort of thing, right? Because we're doing all the writing. But a lot of it is we'll take the feedback and we'll just like throw it in between the three of us, and it'll be like, okay, does this make sense to anybody here in the group, or is it something that we just need to kind of acknowledge that somebody didn't like and move past it? And so kind of doing it by committee, I think, helps that, because no one person is responsible for absorbing the feedback and interpreting the feedback and then making the feedback actionable. It's really kind of done by it's done by committee, and I think that kind of helps soften the blow and help make it a little bit easier to kind of like to navigate through, because we are way harsher to ourselves than any of the feedback that we received in playtesting. Like that, like the number of times that we were talking about how long kind of this process is. I mean, at the point that people are going to actually see some of this stuff, we have beaten ourselves up on it for months, right? And it's kind of one of those things where like, okay, like we all love each other. We all want this book to be the best that it is. And so sometimes that's going to mean that the feedback is going to come off really harsh, but it's all to go ahead and serve the better product. So we're way harsher on ourselves than any of for the most part, the playtest feedback was amazing. Like we really didn't have anything that was like really out in left field. We were way harder on each other. So
yeah,
and we're going to
I would
talk each
say
other off the ledge too when somebody gets over ramped up about a particular piece. So that helps a lot.
like
for
that poor
me,
dinosaur
one
adventure.
of the yeah, exactly. Which is still getting kicked down the road. I think we figured out the magic for that is it's going to be its own entity.
Yep.
But because it just doesn't quite fit. It like parts of it fit different things, but it hasn't been good enough.
Yeah.
So that may be spun off to its own thing. But one of the things that I notice or that I look for in feedback is it because they didn't understand something? Because there is something to be said for we wrote it in a way that our experience makes sense of, but is it written in a way that everybody makes sense of? Very early on in this podcast, some of our early reviews of a lot of the WotC books, I've simply said, I think I know what they were going for, but man, they worded it poorly if that's the case. Right. And so I tend to look at feedback are they questioning what we were trying to go for? Did they not? Did what we were trying to go for not come across? So if feedback comes in as, hey, you did this and I really don't like it, I would have preferred X, Y, or Z. Well, they got what we were going for. So as long as that is actually what we were going for, that's what Josh was speaking about. But if they're saying, hey, I don't understand how this would do these other things, and I'm like, then we probably weren't as clear as we wanted to be about what it was intended for. So we can take that feedback and improve that on the next product. So some of our more recent projects have been more about, we really need to word that a little more clearly. And some of that is we look at the SRD to get very WotC centric language so that it matches the existing game. But some of it is, yep, that is the language that matches the game. But if you look at the questions that are on the Raw Facebook group, you're going to see that's where the problem came in. Nobody got that.
Yeah.
So we're not
Yeah.
using the WotC language because nobody freaking understands it. Let's write our own thing here, or let's write it in our own way. So we are definitely looking at that. We do a lot of double check. Actually, I was working on something earlier today, and while working on it, I had the SRD up on this screen over here, not the ones behind me, but I had it on the screen over here. And I had the document I was working for, the one over here, and I had my notes in the center because I'm like, okay, so there's a reason why nobody uses this in a 5e game. Like, I've never seen this rule in a 5e game, but I was just about to get ready to rewrite those rules, and I'm for this project coming up, and I'm like, so the language here has to change. We're gonna have to do this in a different way, because if nobody uses it, and it's good rules, it's got to be about the writing. So we actually look for that kind of feedback. And like, so when people say I never do that, or when people talk about, oh, there's no rules for this or this or that, is it because it was hidden in a bad area where nobody would get to it? It wasn't highlighted enough? Is it worded poorly? We're looking at all of those things. So I think, like Glenn said, all feedback is valid. It's really up to the content creator to take that feedback and analyze it a little more deeply to figure out where it's coming from, and to be able to turn that into some usable, actionable things. Like I said, I joked around about we use the scientific method when we were playtesting, but we're also kind of using the scientific method for a very artistic endeavor, which is, are people understanding this art form that we're engaged in? And you can kind of make sure, you can kind of find ways to do that.
Touched on in there, I think, really informs the question, and that is that feedback predominantly informs the next project.
Right.
Because you can go crazy going over it, obsessing over it, using a microscope, trying to find every flaw and make it perfect, but it's never going to be. At a certain point, you have to put it out there into the world and let it sink or swim. And at that point, the ship's kind of already sailed. If it's a glaring enough mistake, yes, you can re-update PDF versions online. But any positive or negative, valid feedback that we get, mostly what it's going to do is make us better on our next project.
Yeah. I want to thank Glen, Lewanika, and Josh for joining me today. It was a lot of fun speaking with them, and if you want to check out more, check out our Patreon, where I have an extended cut and some additional footage from this interview. We could have kept talking for hours, but I again want to thank everyone over at the TT Journeys for joining me today. And as always, be kind and roll well.
Didn't know you were opening all of that up, did you?
No, I thought someone froze. I was like, wait, did someone froze?
Nope.
No, I actually just stopped moving. I'm right.
Whenever Lewanika just stops talking, we're all surprised. It takes a minute to understand.